All right, so have you ever wondered how buyer's agents actually get paid?
Hmm.
I mean, it's one of those things that you don't always think about when you're
Right.
caught up in the excitement of buying a house, but
Yeah,
it's a pretty important piece of the puzzle.
absolutely. Especially with all the changes happening in the real estate world these days.
For sure.
All the new rules and regulations.
Yeah, so we're going to do a deep dive into this whole buyer's agent compensation thing today.
Okay.
And we've got some really interesting insights from a company called Buyer's Edge.
I've heard of them.
They've been around for over 35 years in the D.C. metro area,
Wow.
and they do things a little differently.
Oh, so.
Well, they only represent buyers, never sellers.
Interesting. So they're like 100% focused on the buyer side of the transaction.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
No conflict of interest there.
That makes sense. It eliminates that whole potential for, well, whose interests are really being served.
Right, and they've been doing this for a long time, too, way before all these recent regulations made it mandatory.
Huh. So they were ahead of the curve.
Yeah, they've always had this policy of putting everything in writing right from the start.
So like a clear agreement on how they get paid.
Exactly. A written agreement with every single client outlining their commission rate.
Okay. That's pretty transparent.
And here's the kicker. Their agreement has this provision that if they can get the seller to cover their fee.
Oh, so they try to get the seller to pay their commission?
Yeah. It offsets what the client would have paid. Basically,
Okay.
the buyer wins.
Wow, that sounds pretty good for the buyer, but I'm curious, does that actually happen very often?
Well, according to them, 99% of their transactions end up with their fee being covered through these agreements with the listing agent and the seller.
99%. That's impressive. It seems like they've really figured out how to make this model work.
But there were a few cases where clients actually decided to pay Buyer's Edge directly, even though they could have had the seller cover it.
That's interesting. Why would someone choose to do that?
It sounds like those were strategic decisions. Maybe they were trying to make their offer more competitive.
Right? Maybe sweeten the deal somehow?
Or there were specific terms they were trying to negotiate that made it advantageous to pay the fee themselves.
I see it adds another layer of strategy to the whole negotiation process.
Right, so it's not always as simple as just having the seller cover the cost.
No, it seems like there can be a lot of factors at play.
Exactly. Well, speaking of changing things up, there's been a big shift in the industry lately.
Oh, yeah, with those lawsuits and the Department of Justice stepping in.
Right, they basically threw out the old way of doing cooperative commissions.
It's a pretty big deal, this whole move towards transparency.
Definitely for a long time, buyers were kind of in the dark about how these commissions worked.
Yeah, it's all very hush-hush.
Now every agent has to have a signed agreement with their client that spells out exactly how they'll be paid and how much.
No more hiding the details.
Nope. Everyone's got to play by the same rules now.
So even though Buyer's Edge was already doing this, now it's like the industry standard.
Exactly, and that's a good thing, right?
Oh, absolutely. It levels the playing field and gives buyers more power.
So for someone who's out there thinking about buying a home, especially in a crazy market like the DMV, what does all this mean for them?
Good question. Let's unpack that a bit.
Okay, so what are the key takeaways here?
Well, the biggest one is that signed agreements are non-negotiable now, no matter who you're working with.
So no more handshake deals.
Exactly. And that means those commissions need to be talked about and agreed upon up front.
Right, from the get-go.
Yeah. And this is where things might get a little sticky for some buyers.
Oh, wow, so?
Well, you might run into sellers who aren't up to speed on these new rules or just don't want to pay a buyer's agent commission at all.
So what happens if a seller flat out refuses? What options does a buyer have?
Let's say a seller digs in their heels, says, no way, I'm not paying that.
Okay, then what?
Well, the buyer has a couple of choices. They could offer a higher price to cover that commission, roll it into the mortgage.
Right, or adjust the price if it's a cash deal.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But it definitely adds another layer of complexity to the negotiation.
So even though the rules are supposed to make things more transparent, it sounds like the actual process might still be pretty tricky.
Yeah, you really need a good agent in your corner, someone who knows how to navigate those conversations.
For sure, someone who can advocate for you and make sure you're getting a fair deal.
Absolutely. It's more important than ever to have that expert guidance.
Well, it seems like Buyer's Edge is all for these changes. They see it as a win for transparency and buyer-centric practices.
Which makes sense considering they've been doing it that way for years.
They've always been about making the home buying process in the DMV as smooth and fair as possible.
It's pretty commendable that they've stuck to their principles even before it became the norm.
And all this comes from Stephen Carpenter Israel. He's the president and broker of Buyer's Edge.
Okay, and they've got offices all over the DMV, right?
Yeah, everywhere from Bethesda to DuPont Circle in D.C., Northern Virginia, Howard County.
Wow, they really cover a lot of ground.
Prince George's County, Virginia, Hunt Country, even Baltimore.
It's impressive how they've managed to apply this model across so many different markets.
It makes you wonder if this could work in other parts of the country too? Places with totally different real estate landscapes.
That's a good question for another deep dive, maybe.
Yeah, we'll have to explore that sometime.
But for now, let's get back to the DMV and what all this means for buyers here.
Okay, so what are your biggest takeaways from all this?
You know what really strikes me is how much emphasis there is now on empowering buyers with information.
Right, no more keeping them in the dark.
Exactly, and with that knowledge comes the responsibility to use it.
So buyers need to be informed and ask the right questions.
Absolutely. They need to understand how their agent is getting paid and how that might affect the advice they're getting.
That makes a lot of sense.
Because at the end of the day, it's about making sure your interests are protected.
It's like the saying goes, knowledge is power.
Especially when you're talking about buying a home, which is a huge decision.
So we've learned a lot about buyers' agents and how this whole commission structure is changing.
And I think the key takeaway here is that transparency and putting the buyer first, those are the things that really matter.
Absolutely. If you're in the DMV and looking for more information about buying a home or just want to learn more about this topic,
check out Buyer's Edge's website, buyersagent.com. They've got tons of resources.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today.
Yeah, we've really dug deep.
But before we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about.
Okay, shoot.
Knowing that these changes are pretty new, do you think this push for more transparency will actually benefit both buyers and agents in the long run?
That's a really interesting question.
I'd love to hear what our listeners think.
Yeah, let's get a conversation going on social media.
We always appreciate your insights and experiences.
Every home buying journey is different.
So keep those questions coming, and until next time, happy house hunting.
To a smooth and informed process.
Absolutely.
Cheers to that.
All right, we'll see you next time.
See ya. Well, for someone who's thinking about buying a home right now, especially in a market like the DMV.
Yeah, it means they really need to understand these changes.
So what are the biggest things buyers need to keep in mind?
Well, first off, signed agreements with agents, those are mandatory now.
No matter what.
No matter who you're working with.
So no more like, just agreeing on things verbally.
Right. It's got to be in writing.
And that means commissions have to be discussed up front.
Yeah. No more surprises down the road.
And this is where it could get a little tricky for buyers.
You think so?
I mean, what happens if you find a seller who's not familiar with these new rules?
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. Some sellers might push back.
Or maybe they just don't want to pay a buyer's agent commission at all.
So what happens then?
Yeah, what are the buyer's options if a seller says, no way, I'm not paying that?
Well, in those cases, the buyer would have to decide if they want to up their offer to cover the commission.
Okay.
Or they could try to negotiate some other kind of arrangement.
I see. So it's not always as straightforward as it seems.
It definitely adds a layer of complexity to the negotiation, especially if you're in a competitive market.
Right, where you might already be stretching your budget.
It sounds like having a really good agent is more important than ever.
Oh, absolutely. Someone who can guide you through those tough conversations.
Someone who knows how to handle those tricky situations.
Exactly. And who has your best interests at heart.
Well, it seems like Buyer's Edge is happy about these changes.
It makes sense, right?
Yeah, they've been advocating for transparency for years.
And they've always been all about putting the buyer first.
Making sure the process is fair and easy to understand.
It's pretty impressive that they've been operating this way for so long.
Way before it was required by law.
So they were ahead of the curve.
Yeah, they really seem to be committed to doing things the right way.
And this all comes from Stephen Carpenter Israel, the president and broker of Buyer's Edge.
Right, and their company, they've got offices all over the DMV.
Yeah, they're pretty widespread.
Bethesda DuPont Circle, in D.C., Northern Virginia, Howard County.
It's amazing how they've managed to make this model work in so many different markets.
Prince George's County, Virginia, Hunt Country, even Baltimore.
Wow, they've really got the whole region covered.
It makes you wonder if this approach could be successful in other parts of the country, too.
That's an interesting thought.
Places where the real estate market is completely different.
Yeah, we should explore that sometime.
But for now, let's stick with the DMV.
Okay, so what are your biggest takeaways from all this?
Well, what really stands out to me is how much emphasis there is now on educating buyers.
Oh, for sure.
Giving them the information they need to make smart decisions.
No more secrets, no more smoke and mirrors.
Exactly. And that means buyers have to step up too.
How so?
They need to be proactive, ask questions, do their research.
Right. They can't just rely on their agent to handle everything.
They need to understand how the process works and how their agent is getting paid.
because that can influence the advice they're getting.
Right. And ultimately, it's about protecting their own interests.
Knowledge is power, especially when you're talking about buying a house.
Absolutely. So we've learned a lot about buyer's agents and how this whole commission structure is evolving.
It's a fascinating topic.
And I think the key takeaway here is that transparency and putting the buyer first, those are the principles that really matter.
At the end of the day, it's about making sure the buyer has a positive experience.
And if you're in the DMV and looking for more information about buying a home or just want to learn more about this whole buyer's agent thing,
Check out Buyer's Edge's website, buyersagent.com.
they've got a ton of great resources.
Articles, tips, videos.
Everything you need to know.
So we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
Yeah, it's been a really informative conversation.
But before we wrap things up, I
Yeah.
want to leave our listeners with something to ponder.
Okay, what's that?
Knowing that all these changes to the industry are fairly recent, do you think this move towards more transparency will actually benefit both buyers and agents in the long run?
That's a great question.
It'll be interesting to see how things play out over time.
What do you think?
Well, I have my own thoughts, but I'd love to hear from our listeners.
Yeah, let's get a conversation going on social media.
Share your experiences, your insights, your predictions.
We always appreciate your feedback.
Every home buying journey is unique.
So let's learn from each other.
And keep those questions coming.
Until next time,
Happy house hunting.
to a smooth and informed process.
Absolutely.
It's a big question. Yeah. Will this actually lead to more trust between buyers and agents? Or will it create a whole new set of challenges that we haven't even thought about yet?
It's hard to say for sure, but it'll be interesting to see how it all unfolds.
Yeah, time will tell.
Time will tell.
But we want to hear from you, our listeners.
Yeah.
What do you think about this whole transparency thing?
Yeah. Jump into the conversation on social media.
Tell us about your experiences, your thoughts, your predictions.
We're all ears.
We love hearing from you and getting your perspectives.
Because every home buying journey is unique.
And there's always something new to learn.
Absolutely. So keep those questions coming.
And until next time,
Happy house hunting, everyone.
make it a good one.
To a smooth and informed process.
Cheers to that.